The morning Alfred Watkins rode onto Effie Townsend's land with a leather satchel full of legal papers and a head full of business, he had not the faintest intention of losing his heart before sunset. The Colorado Territory in the spring of 1878 was a land that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful, and Alfred Watkins prided himself on being very careful indeed. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, and wore his dark suit the way most men out here wore their work clothes, like armor. He had ridden up from Denver on behalf of the Continental Cattle Consortium, a group of Eastern investors who had decided that the grazing land along the Sweetwater Flats represented the single most profitable untapped resource in the southern Colorado Territory. They weren't wrong. The grass that rolled across those flats in long, silky waves was the kind of grass that put weight on cattle like nothing else in the region, and the creek that wound through the middle of it never ran dry, not even in the driest August on record. Alfred had done his research. He always did his research. What his research had not adequately prepared him for was Effie Townsend. He saw her first from perhaps 200 yards out, standing on the top rail of a wooden fence corral in the way that a person stands when they are absolutely certain the fence belongs to them, and they have every right in the world to be standing on it. She was in a faded blue work dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her dark hair was pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades. She was watching him ride in with her arms crossed over her chest, and even from that distance, Alfred could tell that she already knew why he was coming. He pulled his horse to a stop at the gate and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, ma'am. I'm looking for the proprietor of the Townsend Ranch." She stepped down off the fence rail with the ease of someone who had been climbing fences since she could walk. "You found her," she said, and her voice was clear and steady, with just the faintest edge of something he couldn't quite identify. Not hostility exactly, more like preparedness. Alfred blinked. He had assumed, and he now recognized that assumption for the foolishness it was, that he would be meeting a husband or perhaps an older brother. "Miss Townsend," he tried. "Mrs. Townsend," she said, and she said it in the particular way that a widow says it when she wants you to understand that she answers to no one living. "Husband passed 3 years ago. The land is mine by deed. I'd ask you to get that straight before you say another word." Alfred dismounted, because it felt wrong to have this conversation from the back of a horse when she was standing on the ground with her boots planted in the dirt like she'd grown there. "I apologize," he said, and he meant it. "Mrs. Townsend, my name is Alfred Watkins. I've come on behalf of the Continental Cattle Consortium out of Denver." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and started walking toward the house without telling him to follow. But somehow it was entirely understood that he was meant to. The ranch house was small but solid, built from timber and stone in the way that people in the territory built things when they meant them to last. There was a kitchen garden running along the south wall with herbs and early spring vegetables coming up in neat rows, and there were 2 large dogs of indeterminate breed sleeping on the porch who lifted their heads when Alfred approached and then, apparently finding him acceptable, went back to sleep. Through the open barn door, he could see a hand working with a horse, a young man, perhaps 17, with the focused look of someone who was still learning and knew it. "That's my hired man, Tommy Briggs," Effie said, without looking back. "He lives in the bunkhouse. It's just the 2 of us running this place." She said it matter-of-factly, but Alfred heard the weight of it. 2 people running a cattle operation on several hundred acres of grazing land was not easy work. She poured coffee from a pot on the wood stove and set a cup in front of him at the kitchen table without asking if he wanted any. Then she sat down across from him with her own cup and looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "Say what you came to say, Mr. Watkins." He opened his satchel and laid the papers on the table. He had a whole speech prepared, full of careful language about land development and regional economic growth and fair market compensation. He had given a version of this speech perhaps a dozen times in the past 2 years, to ranchers and farmers and small holders all across the territory, and it generally went one of two ways. Either the person accepted the offer, or they didn't, and then he reported back to the consortium and they decided how much more pressure to apply. It was business. Alfred was good at it. But sitting across from Effie Townsend in her small, clean kitchen with the smell of coffee in the air and the sound of wind moving through the new grass outside the window, the speech didn't come. He looked at the papers. He looked at her. He said, "The consortium wants to purchase your grazing rights. All 460 acres of the Sweetwater Flats. They're prepared to offer a fair price." Effie wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "How much?" he told her. It was actually a generous figure. The consortium had authorized him to go high because they wanted this particular piece settled quickly. He watched her face. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look pleased or relieved either. She looked like someone who had already done the math and knew exactly what the number meant. "That would clear my debts," she said quietly. "My husband took on a loan before he passed. The bank in Morrow Creek has been very patient, but patient has its limits." "The offer would more than cover any outstanding debt," Alfred said carefully. "Yes," she said, "and then I'd have nothing left." She looked up at him and there was no anger in it, just a kind of flat honesty that he found unexpectedly striking. "Those grazing rights are how I run my cattle business, Mr. Watkins. Without access to the Sweetwater Flats, my herd can't survive a dry summer. Without my herd, there's no ranch. Without the ranch, there's nothing. I'd take your money and inside of 3 years I'd have spent down to nothing and I'd have no land and no livelihood. So you see, the price doesn't actually matter very much." Alfred stared at her. In all his calculations, in all his careful research, he had not accounted for this particular kind of clear-sightedness. Most people, when presented with a sum of money large enough to clear their debts, felt a surge of relief that temporarily clouded their longer view. Effie Townsend apparently did not operate on surges of relief. "The consortium would need a decision within 30 days, he said, because he didn't know what else to say. "They'll have one," she said. "The answer is no." He blinked. "Mrs. Townsend, I don't think you fully—" "I understand completely," she said, not unkindly. "You've ridden a long way and I won't send you off without a proper meal, but the answer is no. It was no before you arrived and it'll be no when you leave." She stood up and moved to the stove, and he understood that the formal portion of the conversation was over. Alfred sat at that kitchen table for a moment longer, looking at the papers in front of him and feeling, for the first time in a long time, like he had met something he hadn't planned for. He ate the meal she cooked, salt pork, biscuits and beans that had been slow cooking since morning. And they talked, or rather she answered his questions with the economy of a woman who did not waste words. And gradually he stopped asking the questions he had come prepared to ask and started asking other ones. How long had her family been in the territory? She had come out with her husband, James Townsend, in 1872, 6 years ago, when she was 23 years old. They had built the ranch from nothing. James had been a good man and a hard worker, and had fallen to a fever in the winter of 1875. She was 29 now. She had kept the ranch going through 2 hard winters and a drought summer because she had not known what else to do, and because she had promised James she would. Alfred listened to all of this, and felt something uncomfortable and unfamiliar shifting around inside his chest. He thanked her for the meal and gathered his papers, and said he would be staying at the hotel in Morrow Creek, and that she was welcome to reach him there if she changed her mind. He said it professionally and without pressure, which surprised him, because pressure was generally the next tool in the consortium's kit. She walked him to the gate and stood there while he mounted, and she looked up at him in the afternoon light with one hand shielding her eyes from the low western sun, and she said, "You seem like a decent enough man, Mr. Watkins, for someone in your line of work." He didn't quite know how to take that, and he rode back to Morrow Creek thinking about it the entire way. Morrow Creek was a proper town of perhaps 400 souls, built along the main road that connected the northern and southern halves of the territory's cattle country. It had a hotel, 3 saloons, a general store, a livery, a church, a school, a bank, a post office, and a land registry office that Alfred had already visited on his first day in town. He also knew, from the land registry, that the bank in Morrow Creek held a note against the Townsend property for $1,200, a significant sum that had been accumulating interest for nearly 3 years. He sat in his hotel room that first evening and wrote his report to the consortium in Denver. He wrote that Mrs. Townsend had declined the initial offer. He wrote that he believed the property's financial situation made it likely she would eventually be compelled to sell. He set down his pen and looked at what he had written and did not send it. He told himself he was simply being thorough. He told himself he would spend a few more days in Morrow Creek doing additional assessment before filing his report. This was not unusual. He had done it before on complicated acquisitions. He was nothing if not thorough. He did not tell himself that he was thinking about a woman with dark eyes and biscuits that were the best he had eaten in 4 years of riding across the territory. The next morning he rode out to the Sweetwater Flats without any particular purpose, and he found himself standing at the edge of the creek watching it run over smooth stones and thinking about what it would mean if this was all purchased by the consortium and turned over to a large commercial cattle operation. The grass would be stripped. The creek would be diverted or contaminated. The small ranch that sat at the edge of it all would wither and die. He had done this before. He had facilitated it many times. He was good at not thinking too carefully about the downstream consequences. He rode back through the south edge of the property on his way to town and came across Effie at work mending a section of fence line alone, with Tommy Briggs nowhere in sight. She had her tools spread out around her and was working with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this particular job many times and resented every minute of it. When she heard his horse, she straightened and watched him approach without any particular expression. "You're still in Morrow Creek," she said. "I'm doing additional assessment," he said. "Standard practice." She looked at the broken fence section and then back at him. "Can you work a fence post?" she asked. "Because I've got 2 hands and one of them has a blister the size of a Liberty dollar and Tommy's down with a stomach complaint." He was in his suit. He looked down at himself and then back at her. "I can work a fence post," he said, and dismounted. They worked side by side for 2 hours in the warming mid-morning sun, and Alfred discovered that he had not entirely forgotten how to do physical work, which surprised him. He had grown up on a farm in Ohio before he had educated himself up and out of it, and the muscle memory of it was apparently still there in his hands and back and arms. Effie worked without fussing over him or checking what he was doing, which he found both respectful and slightly alarming, as if she simply expected that if he said he could do something, he could do it. "You didn't grow up in an office," she said at one point, watching him drive a post. "Ohio," he said. "Farm country. So you know what it is to work land," she said. "I know what it is to leave land," he said, and she looked at him in the sharp-edged way she had of looking at things like she was measuring them. "Why?" she asked. He drove the last nail and straightened up. "I wanted something different," he said. "I wanted to see how the larger world worked. I wanted to understand money and business and law." He paused. "I succeeded at most of that." "But," she said. "But nothing," he said, though they both seemed to understand that there was a but hiding somewhere in the vicinity of that answer. She handed him a canteen and he drank from it and handed it back, and there was something easy about the gesture, the passing back and forth of something between 2 people who were not yet friends but were perhaps on the way to being something. "Why won't you sell?" he asked, "and I'm not asking on behalf of the consortium, I'm just asking." She took her own drink from the canteen and looked out across the flats. The grass was bending gently in the wind, running in long silver-green waves toward the horizon. "Because James is buried on this land," she said. "Because I spent 6 years building something out of nothing and it's mine. Because if I sell, I'm acknowledging that it was all temporary, that I was just passing through. And I wasn't passing through. I came here to stay." He was quiet for a moment. "The consortium could apply pressure through the bank," he said, and he said it quietly and with his eyes on the grass rather than on her, because he wanted her to know it was a warning rather than a threat. She was quiet for a beat. "I know that," she said. "I've been expecting it." "You should know it's a possibility," he said. "You're telling me this why?" she asked. He thought about that. "Because I don't think it would be right," he said finally. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he felt the look like a hand on his shoulder. "No," she said, "it wouldn't be right." Then she gathered her tools and started walking back toward the house, and he walked beside her, leading his horse, and neither of them said anything else for a while. But the silence was a different kind of silence than the one they had started the day with. Over the following week, Alfred found reasons to remain in Morrow Creek that became gradually less professional and more personal, though he spent considerable mental energy not acknowledging this fact. He rode out to the ranch every other day, sometimes with a question about the land that was genuinely relevant to his assessment, sometimes with supplies he picked up at the general store that he told himself were items she might need, sometimes with no reason at all except that he had saddled his horse, and it had seemed to know the direction. Effie accepted his presence with the same matter-of-fact quality that she seemed to bring to most things. She did not flutter. She did not grow shy or suddenly elaborate in her dress or manner. She simply continued being exactly who she was, and she made room for him at her table and included him in the work when there was work to be done. And she talked to him in the evenings on the porch while the Colorado sky went through its extraordinary show of color, with a frankness that he found more intoxicating than any whiskey he had ever drunk. She told him about the territory, about the Ute peoples who had lived on this land for generations before the settlers came pushing in, and about how the government had been moving them onto reservations, and she said it with a quiet sadness and a clear-eyed recognition of the injustice of it that surprised him. Most people he met in the territory preferred not to examine those particular facts too closely. Effie Townsend looked at them straight on. "My husband James used to trade fairly with the Utes," she said one evening. "He believed you could either be a neighbor or an enemy, and he'd rather be a neighbor. I've kept on with that as best I can." "And now?" Alfred asked. "And now there are fewer Utes nearby to trade with," she said. "They've been pushed further west. It's not right, and saying it's not right doesn't fix it, but it's still the truth." He thought about what she said for a long time after he rode back to town that night. He thought about rights and who held them and what they were worth and what they cost, and those thoughts kept sliding, uncomfortably and repeatedly, into thoughts about the consortium and what they were actually doing when they bought out the smaller landholders one by one. On the 8th day, he came out to find her in a state of controlled agitation that was, for Effie Townsend, the equivalent of anyone else's full panic. Tommy Briggs was standing by the barn door with his hat in his hands, and Effie was standing in the middle of the yard looking at a piece of paper with the particular stillness of someone absorbing very bad news. Alfred dismounted and she looked up, and for once she didn't say something brisk and practical. She just held out the letter. He took it and read it. It was from the Morrow Creek Bank. The bank was calling in the full amount of the note, effective in 60 days, citing a clause related to land value reassessment. The entire $1,200 plus accumulated interest, bringing the total to $1,430, due within 60 days. He felt cold. He knew immediately what this was. The consortium had a man at the bank. It was not the first time they had used this particular approach. It was entirely legal and entirely ruthless, and it was being applied to a woman who had done nothing wrong except refuse to sell land that was rightfully hers. He had known this approach was in the consortium's arsenal. He had not expected them to deploy it without notifying him first. He had also not expected it to make him feel the way it made him feel, which was furious in a way that was not professional and not detached and not anything he was used to. "This is the consortium," he said. "I know it is," she said. He looked at her. She was angry too, but under the anger there was something that looked like fear, and he understood that she had been carrying the fear of exactly this kind of moment for 3 years, holding it at bay through work and stubbornness and sheer force of will, and now it had arrived anyway. "I'm going to fix this," he said. She looked at him with an expression that said she wanted very badly to believe that, but had lived long enough to know that wanting something didn't make it so. "You work for the people who did this," she said. "Not anymore," he said, and was surprised to find that he had already decided it. He had decided it somewhere in the space between reading the letter and speaking those two words, and it felt not like a reckless choice, but like the only choice that made any sense given everything he knew about himself and everything he had learned about her in 8 days. She stared at him for a long moment. "You would do that," she said carefully. "Give up your position. For me." "I would do it because it's right," he said, and then, because honesty had a way of spreading once you let it start, he added, "And yes, for you." She looked away across the flats and he couldn't read her face from the side, and the wait felt very long. Then she looked back at him. "Don't make promises on the back of a feeling, Mr. Watkins," she said quietly. "I've had enough of promises that couldn't hold." "I'm not making a promise on the back of a feeling," he said. "I'm making a plan." She seemed to consider him very carefully then, as if she were assessing him the way she assessed cattle, looking for soundness and substance, and the kind of thing you couldn't see from the outside but had to judge from a combination of evidence and instinct. Then she nodded once slowly and said, "All right, tell me the plan." Alfred rode back to Morrow Creek that afternoon and spent 2 hours in his hotel room writing letters. One was to the Continental Cattle Consortium, informing them in precise legal language that he was resigning his position effective immediately, citing irreconcilable differences with the methods being employed in the Colorado territory acquisitions. The second letter was to a man named Bernard Collier, who was a land attorney in Denver and who owed Alfred a professional favor of some standing, asking him to examine whether the bank's loan call could be challenged on the grounds of irregular application of the reassessment clause. The third letter was to his own bank in Denver, requesting a transfer of funds. He sent the first 2 letters on the evening stage and held the third one in his hand for a moment before he sent it, because the amount he was requesting from his own savings was significant. It would not ruin him, but it would not leave him comfortable, and he was a man who had spent a decade building himself a comfortable financial position precisely because he had grown up without one. He sent the third letter. Then he went to the saloon and ordered a whiskey and sat at the bar and thought about what he had just done. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Grover who had apparently been in Morrow Creek since the town had 2 buildings, set the glass in front of him and leaned on the bar and said, "You look like a man who just made a big decision." "I resigned from my employment," Alfred said. Said Grover. "The consortium job." Alfred looked at him. "You know about it." "Everybody in Morrow Creek knows about it," Grover said. "Small town, word gets around. People are worried about what happens if the consortium buys up all the grazing rights in the flats. Changes everything." He polished a glass. "You resign because you're on the right side of it or the wrong side." Alfred drank his whiskey. "The right side," he said. "I hope." "The Townsend woman, I'd guess," Grover said without inflection. Alfred looked at him again. Grover smiled, which was a surprisingly warm expression on his large, rough face. "Like I said," he said, "small town." Alfred stayed at the saloon longer than he intended, and before the evening was out, he found himself in conversation with a man named Silas Drucker, who ranched about 12 miles north of Morrow Creek and who turned out to have a strong and well-articulated opinion about the consortium's land acquisition practices in the territory. Drucker was a big man in his mid-40s with a graying mustache and a directness that Alfred respected, and he had been watching the consortium move through the region the way you watch a fire moving across dry grass, knowing it was going to reach you eventually and trying to figure out how to build the right kind of fire break. "The problem," Drucker said, "is that people are dealing with them one at a time. Each rancher sits alone with their loan and their worry, and they feel like they're the only one. But we're not. There are 14 small operations in the Sweetwater Flats watershed that the consortium could go after. If even 8 of us organized and got a proper attorney to look at their practices. I have an attorney looking at the bank's loan call against the Townsend property right now, Alfred said. Drucker looked at him with new interest. Is that so? It is, Alfred said. His name is Bernard Collier. He is thorough and he does not like irregular bank practices. Drucker was quiet for a moment, then he extended his hand and Alfred shook it. I'd like to meet this Mr. Collier, Drucker said. Things moved faster over the next 2 weeks than Alfred had expected, which he supposed was what happened when you stopped managing a situation and started actually engaging with it. Bernard Collier arrived from Denver on the Tuesday stage, a small, sharp-faced man with reading glasses and a briefcase full of patience, and he spent 3 days examining records at the Morrow Creek Bank and Land Registry, and came out of it with the look of a man who had found exactly what he was looking for. The reassessment clause in the Townsend note, Collier said, sitting at Alfred's small hotel table with papers spread around him, was applied using a property valuation that was conducted by a firm with direct financial ties to the Continental Cattle Consortium. That is a conflict of interest that renders the valuation legally suspect and the loan call potentially invalid. Additionally, 2 other ranchers in this area have received similar calls based on the same questionable valuation. He looked at Alfred over his reading glasses. Someone in Denver got impatient. The acquisition timeline was moved up, Alfred said. I wasn't notified. Yes, well, I suspect that was because they anticipated you might not be fully cooperative, Collier said, with the mild tone of a man who did not particularly judge people for inconveniently developing a conscience. The good news is that this gives us substantial grounds to challenge the bank's position. The less good news is that a legal challenge takes time, and in the meanwhile, the loan technically stands. I'm covering the immediate debt personally, Alfred said. Collier looked at him. Alfred, he said, because they had known each other long enough for first names. That's a considerable sum. It's manageable, Alfred said. Collier studied him for a moment. This is about more than a land deal, he said. It's about doing the right thing, Alfred said. Collier continued studying him for another moment. The woman is remarkable from what I hear, he said. Alfred said nothing, which Collier apparently found sufficient. The conversation Alfred had with Effie about the money was, without question, the most difficult conversation he had navigated in a long time, and he had navigated some very difficult conversations in his professional life. He told her plainly and without ornamentation. He intended to pay the outstanding loan balance on her behalf, which would stop the bank's action and give Collier the time needed to challenge the legal validity of the call entirely. She sat across the kitchen table from him, and she was very still and very quiet for a long time, and he had learned enough about her to know that the stillness and the quiet meant she was feeling something large rather than that she was feeling nothing. I cannot take charity, she said finally. It is not charity, he said. It is a loan. You would repay me over time at the same interest rate the bank was charging, when and as the ranch generates the income to do so. She looked at him directly. And if I told you I never intended to repay it because I intended to put a bullet in you before you left this ranch, what would you say? He was so startled by this that he nearly laughed, and then he did laugh, and she looked at him with the faintest trace of amusement pulling at the corner of her mouth. I would say that would be a poor return on my investment, he managed, she said. Then she was quiet again, and the amusement faded into something more serious. Why are you doing this, Alfred? It was the first time she had used his given name, and the effect of it was something he was not prepared for. He was quiet for a moment, marshaling honesty the way a careful man marshals resources. Because I helped create the situation that put you here, he said. By working for the consortium and helping them acquire smaller properties across the territory, I contributed to the financial pressure on operations like yours. I am not the only cause of your trouble, but I am one of them, and that sits badly with me." He paused. "And because," he stopped. "Because," she said. "Because in 8 years of riding around this territory closing deals," he said, "I have never met anyone like you, and I find I am not willing to ride away from that." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight and texture to it. The kind that isn't empty, but full of things that are being said without words. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and one of the dogs on the porch got up and settled again with a heavy thump. "You should know," she said very carefully, "that I am not in a position to offer you anything in return for this. I am not a transaction, Mr. Watkins." "Alfred," he said. She looked at him. "Alfred," she said, and again it moved through him like something warm. "I need you to understand that I'm not going to feel obligated to you because of money. If I allow this, it's because it's a fair arrangement. A loan, as you said, nothing else attached to it. Nothing else is asked," he said. "Whatever else may or may not happen between us has nothing to do with the loan. They are separate things entirely." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "All right," and it felt like something very significant settling into place. The following Friday, Alfred walked into the Morrow Creek Bank with Bernard Collier and a bank draft for $1,430, and a letter from Collier outlining the legal challenge to the loan call's validity. And the bank manager, a thin, anxious man named Prester who had clearly been expecting some kind of reaction, but not this specific one, accepted the payment and agreed to halt further action pending the legal review, and signed the paper Collier put in front of him with the look of a man who was already composing his explanatory letter to someone further up the chain. On the way out of the bank, Collier said, "That went well," in the satisfied tone of a man who had just outmaneuvered something. Alfred looked up at the Colorado sky, which was doing something spectacular with its clouds, and felt lighter than he had felt in years. He went out to the ranch that afternoon and told Effie what had happened, and she listened to all of it, and then she let out a long, slow breath, and he watched some of the tension she carried between her shoulder blades ease slightly, like a rope that had been cut at one end. "The legal challenge?" she asked. "Collier is confident. It'll take some months, but he believes we can have the note reassessed at fair market terms and the reassessment clause struck. In the meantime, the loan is settled and the bank can't move against the property." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come on, then," and walked toward the barn, and he followed, not sure what he was following her to. What he was following her to was a mare who had been trying to foal since the previous night and having difficulty with it. And Effie needed an extra pair of hands, and Tommy Briggs had ridden to town for supplies. Alfred rolled up his sleeves, and they worked through the next 2 hours in the warm, close darkness of the barn. And the work was hard and urgent and required full attention. And somewhere in the middle of it, in the moment when the foal finally slid into the world all long legs and bright-eyed astonishment, Effie looked up at Alfred across the animal, and there were tears on her face that she was not embarrassed about, and he thought he had never seen anything so honest in his entire life. They named the foal Liberty, which Effie said with a small private smile that Alfred understood was about more than just the foal. He stayed for supper again, and after supper they sat on the porch in the cooling evening air, and she poured 2 small glasses of something she said was apple brandy that a neighbor woman had put up the previous fall, and they drank it slowly while the stars came up one by one over the vast dark Colorado sky. The dogs were at their feet. There was a coyote calling somewhere to the south, distant and mournful. The new foal was quiet in the barn. "Tell me what you're going to do now," Effie said. "You've no job. You've thinned your savings. What's the plan, Alfred?" He liked that she was practical even now. It was one of the things he liked most about her, that she moved toward the useful question rather than away from it. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "Collier has asked me if I'd consider working with him on land law cases in the territory. There are a number of operations that need the kind of assessment and negotiation expertise I have, and Collier doesn't want to ride circuit himself." He paused. He has cases in this region that would keep me in Morrow Creek for a good while." She looked at him sideways. "In Morrow Creek," she said. "It's a reasonable town," he said. "Good people. Better than average biscuits if you know where to eat them." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are a very unusual man, Alfred Watkins." "I take that as a compliment," he said. "It was intended as one," she said. They sat in silence for a while, and it was one of those silences that has warmth in it, that wraps around two people like an extra blanket on a cold night. The coyote called again. One of the dogs lifted its head and then lowered it. "When James died," Effie said quietly, "I decided I wasn't going to be anyone who needed rescue. I'd seen too many women out here trade one dependence for another, marry the first man who offered because they were afraid of the alternative and end up worse for it." She looked at her glass. "I decided this ranch was going to survive because of what I built and what I knew and what I worked, not because some man came along and fixed things for me." "And now some man has come along and fixed things for you," Alfred said carefully. "You didn't fix it," she said just as carefully. "You helped me buy time to fight for what's mine. There's a difference." He thought about that. "You're right," he said. "There is." She turned to look at him, and the moonlight was on her face, and she looked steadier and more certain than anyone he had ever known, and he felt something that he recognized, with the peculiar clarity of a man who has spent a long time being careful, as love. Uncomplicated, inconvenient, complete. He had not been looking for it and had not known he was missing it, and now that it was here, sitting next to him on a wooden porch in the Colorado Territory with apple brandy in her hand, he had no idea what to do with it except be honest. "Effie," he said. "Alfred," she said, with the faintest trace of amusement. "I am very aware that you don't need me," he said, "and I find that I am not frightened by that. I am not under the impression that you require saving, and I am not here because I want to feel like the man who saved you. I'm here because sitting on this porch with you is the most comfortable I have been in a decade, and I would like to keep sitting on it if you'll permit it." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her thinking, weighing, assessing. Then something shifted slightly in her expression, something that wasn't soft exactly but was open, the way a door opens when someone turns the right key. "You'd better understand," she said, "that I run this place. I make the decisions about the land and the cattle and the money and the labor. I don't share that with anyone unless they earn it." "Understood," he said. "And if you're going to be around," she said, "you're going to work. I don't have room for ornamental people." "Also understood," he said. "And if we're going to—" She stopped, and something that might have been color moved across her face, and he found this unexpectedly, completely endearing. "If this is going to become something," she said carefully, "it moves at my pace." "All right," he said. She looked at him as though she expected more conditions or negotiations. When there were none, she seemed faintly nonplussed by the simplicity of it. She looked back at the sky. After a moment she said, quietly, "I'm going to need a hand with the south fence line tomorrow morning." He smiled at the sky. "I'll be here at first light," he said. He was. He was there every morning for the next 3 weeks, working alongside her, and Tommy Briggs through the full catalog of spring ranch work, repairing fence lines, moving cattle to new grazing sections, dealing with a stubborn patch of drought-hardened ground in the pasture nearest the creek, and managing the weekly accounting that Effie kept in a ledger with precise, small handwriting. Alfred discovered that her accounting was meticulous, but that she had been paying slightly too much for feed grain, because she hadn't known who in the region sold at the best price, and he reorganized the supply arrangements to save her $12 a month, which she accepted with the brisk nod of someone who appreciated practical value. Bernard Collier wrote from Denver to say that the legal challenge was proceeding well, and that he had now taken on 3 additional cases in the Sweetwater Flats area from ranchers who had organized themselves with the help of a man named Silas Drucker. Alfred wrote back saying he was available to handle the local assessment work on all 3 cases and outlined his terms, which were reasonable, and Collier agreed. Alfred moved from the hotel to a boarding house on the east side of Morrow Creek run by a widow named Mrs. Hazel Fitch, who served an excellent breakfast and asked no unnecessary questions, which suited him perfectly. The thing between Alfred and Effie grew the way things grow in good soil, steadily, without drama, sending down roots. It was not a breathless courtship of flowery speeches and theatrical gestures. It was a courtship conducted over fence posts and account books and long rides checking the herd and quiet evenings on the porch, and the occasional supper with Tommy Briggs at the table, who was 17 and observant, and said very little but watched Alfred with the evaluating look of someone who considered himself part of the operation, and therefore had a stake in the outcome. One evening in late May, Tommy had ridden to a neighbor's for the evening, and it was just Alfred and Effie at the supper table, and the conversation had moved from practical things into something less structured, the way conversations do when two people have gradually become comfortable enough to wander. She had been telling him about a summer she spent as a girl in Virginia before the war changed everything, when her father had kept horses and she had ridden every morning before the heat came. She had grown up with horses the way some people grow up with books, fluently and deeply, and with a part of herself wound permanently into them. The war took everything, she said simply. The horses, the farm, most of the people. She was quiet for a moment. I came west because there was nothing in Virginia to come back to. James and I both came from that same nothing and built towards something, which I think is why we fit together. And now, Alfred said, does it still feel like Virginia is nothing? She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. It feels like it was a different life, she said. Sometimes I think about the girl who rode those horses in the morning, and I can hardly believe she and I are the same person. She had everything given to her, and I have nothing that wasn't earned. She looked at him. I prefer what I have now, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. That's remarkable, he said quietly. It's not, she said. It's just honest. You are the most honest person I've ever met, he said. She looked at him, and this time the openness in her expression was unmistakable, and he thought perhaps she was waiting for him to do something with what he had just said, to cross some small remaining distance between them. He was not a shy man, and he was not unaware of his own feelings, but he had promised that this moved at her pace, and he intended to keep that promise. Alfred, she said, and her voice was a shade quieter and a shade warmer than it usually was. You are going to drive me, absolutely, to distraction with your patience. He laughed, genuinely and fully, and she laughed too, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh like that, unguarded, unreserved, joyful. And it was like hearing a piece of music he hadn't known he'd been waiting to hear. He reached across the table, and she met him halfway, and they held hands across the supper dishes, and they sat like that for a long time while the evening settled into night around them. On the first Sunday of June, Alfred asked Tommy Briggs if he might borrow his company for the afternoon, and they rode together to the south edge of the property where the creek bent through a stand of cottonwoods, and Alfred said without preamble, I intend to ask Mrs. Townsend to marry me, and I think you should know that before I do it. Tommy was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. He was a compact, serious young man who had come to the ranch the previous year after his family had lost their homestead claim to a procedural error, and Effie had taken him on with the practicality and quiet kindness that characterized everything she did. He was loyal to her in the specific and total way of someone who had been pulled out of a difficult place by another person's decency. Are you asking my permission? Tommy said carefully. I'm not asking permission, Alfred said. I'm telling you out of respect. You're part of this operation and you've been with her longer than I have, and I think that matters. Tommy thought about this for a while. She hasn't been happy in a long time, he said finally. I mean, she's been fine, she's always fine, but the kind of happy where a person sort of glows when someone comes up the road. He glanced at Alfred sideways. She glows a bit when you come up the road. Alfred absorbed this information. Thank you, Tommy, he said. Don't make her sorry, Tommy said. which was the most words Alfred had heard him put together at once, and which he understood as both a blessing and a warning. He asked her on a Wednesday morning, which was not a particularly romantic day of the week, but the opportunity presented itself naturally, and he had long since concluded that waiting for a perfect moment in the middle of a working ranch was a strategy that led to never. They were walking back from checking on Liberty, the foal, who was growing astonishingly, and had developed the personality of a very small horse who believed it owned the barn and everything in it. Effie was laughing at something Liberty had done, and the morning light was on her face, and Alfred stopped walking. She noticed and stopped too and looked at him. "What?" she said. "Marry me," he said. He had planned a longer speech, and it had simply not arrived, which perhaps was fitting. She looked at him for a full 10 seconds without speaking. He was not sure he breathed during those 10 seconds. "That's not a question," she said. "Effie Townsend, will you marry me?" he amended. She looked at him, and he could see all of it moving through her face, the caution and the longing and the practicality, and the thing underneath all of it that was simply honest feeling, the same thing he had seen in her since the first day she had handed him a canteen across a broken fence post. "Under what terms?" she said. He understood that she was serious and not deflecting, so he was serious and not offended. "The ranch stays yours," he said. "In your name, the deed stays as it is. Whatever help I provide is as a partner in labor and in life, not as an owner. The decisions about this land are yours." She looked at him. "You'd agree to that?" "I'd put it in writing," he said. "Whatever legal form makes you most comfortable." Another long pause. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Liberty made a sound from inside the barn that suggested she wanted attention. "Yes," Effie said. "I'll marry you." He crossed the small remaining distance, and she let him, and he kissed her for the first time in the warm morning air of the Colorado Territory, with the sound of the creek running nearby and the smell of good grass on the wind. And she kissed him back with the same directness that characterized everything she did, and it felt like the most honest thing that had ever happened to him. They were married in the Morrow Creek Church on a Saturday in late July, with Tommy Briggs standing up for Alfred and a neighboring rancher's wife named Clara Drucker, Silas's wife, who had become Effie's closest friend over the previous weeks, standing up for Effie. Bernard Collier came down from Denver for the occasion and sat in the front pew looking pleased with himself in the way of a man who believed he had contributed to a desirable outcome. Grover from the saloon was there, and Mrs. Fitch from the boarding house, and Silas Drucker, and a good number of the Morrow Creek community who had followed the situation with the consortium and the bank, and seemed to feel that this particular resolution was the right one. Effie wore a dress that Clara Drucker had helped her make, a deep blue that was not white or cream because Effie said she had worn white at her first wedding, and this was a different thing and deserved a different color. It suited her. She walked down the aisle by herself, which no one thought was odd because she was Effie Townsend, and everything she did was on her own terms. When she reached the front of the church and stood beside Alfred, she looked at him with her steady, clear-eyed regard, and he thought he must be the most fortunate man in the Colorado Territory, and he said so quietly, and she told him quietly that he was going to embarrass himself in front of the minister, and they were both smiling through their vows, which the minister apparently found somewhat trying but the assembled company found entirely appropriate. The consortium, as it turned out, was not finished with the Sweetwater Flats, but what they met when they turned their attention back to it in August was a fundamentally different landscape than the one they had assessed in the spring. Bernard Collier's legal challenge to the bank's loan calls had succeeded in establishing that the original property valuations were tainted by conflict of interest, which meant that 6 of the challenge cases were resolved in the landowner's favor. The Morrow Creek Bank, under new management after the previous manager resigned under somewhat clouded circumstances, renegotiated the remaining notes at fair terms. Silas Drucker's organization of the smaller ranchers had created a coalition that represented enough collective acreage to require the consortium to deal with the group rather than individuals, which dramatically changed the power dynamic. And Alfred Watkins, who now had a thorough professional knowledge of the consortium's practices and procedures, proved to be a very effective advisor to Bernard Collier on the 3 cases that went as far as the territory's land court. In September, the consortium sent a new representative to Morrow Creek, a younger man named Garrett who wore a clean suit and had the look of someone who had been told to take a more careful approach this time. He met with Alfred at the hotel in Morrow Creek, which Alfred found mildly entertaining, and he offered a revised proposal involving a shared grazing arrangement that would allow the consortium's cattle access to the Sweetwater Flats in exchange for infrastructure investment, a proper water system, and improved road access that would benefit all the landowners in the area. Alfred took the proposal to Effie, who read it 3 times and discussed it for a full evening with Alfred and Silas Drucker. "The infrastructure is genuine value," Effie said. "The water system alone would triple the reliability of the grazing through a dry summer." She looked at Alfred. "What do they actually want out of this?" "A portion of the grazing capacity," Alfred said. "Not ownership, not the rights. Access arrangements with defined terms." "Defined by whom and enforced by what?" Effie asked. "A formal covenant registered with the Territory Land Office," Alfred said. "With Collier's review, the terms would be clear and enforceable." She thought about it. The coalition of ranchers met twice more, and the terms were negotiated with the consortium's Garrett over 3 weeks of careful, documented conversation in which Alfred served as the ranchers' primary negotiator, and Collier reviewed every draft. The final arrangement was one that gave the consortium limited seasonal grazing access to designated sections of the Sweetwater Flats in exchange for the water system investment and annual payments to each landowner based on the acreage accessed. The Townsend property was included, with Effie holding the strongest terms in the agreement because her land was the most central to the Flats' water access. Garrett, signing the final version, said to Alfred with the rueful respect of someone who had been thoroughly outmaneuvered by someone who knew the game better than he did, "You were the best negotiator they had in the territory." "I know," Alfred said pleasantly. When the papers were signed and the infrastructure work began in the fall, the Townsend Ranch received the first section of the new water system, which meant that the creek's flow was regularized and the grazing capacity of the flats was genuinely improved. Effie stood at the edge of the work one afternoon watching the crew laying pipe and said to Alfred quietly, "We came out better than we started." "You came out better than you started," he said. "I just provided some structural assistance." She gave him the look that she gave him when he was being modest about something in a way she found mildly irritating. "We," she said firmly. He smiled. "We," he agreed. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was a proper Colorado winter, hard and long and beautiful in the specific way of things that are both brutal and magnificent. Alfred learned about cattle operation in winter the way he had learned everything practical in his adult life, by doing it under the guidance of someone who knew more than he did, and being willing to be wrong several times before getting it right. Effie was a patient teacher, though she was not an indulgent one, and if he made an error she told him plainly and without ceremony, and he appreciated that more than any amount of gentling. Tommy Briggs, who had turned 18 in October and was growing into a capable young man at a rate that was both gratifying and slightly startling, took on more responsibility through the winter months, and Alfred worked alongside him and learned from him as readily as from Effie, which Tommy seemed to appreciate. The bunkhouse got a proper stove in November, which Alfred arranged through the general store, and which Tommy accepted with characteristic economy of expression. But he named the stove after Alfred in a private joke that they both found funnier each time it came up. On a cold, clear morning in February, with the snow thick on the ground and the cattle clustered in the south pasture, Effie told Alfred she was expecting their child. She told him at breakfast, in the same tone she might have used to report that the account books were balanced, which was so perfectly and characteristically her that he laughed, and she gave him a look that suggested she was not sure whether to be amused or offended. And he reached across and took her hands and said, with complete sincerity, that he was the happiest man in the Colorado Territory. And she said that he really did say that quite a lot, and he said that it continued to be true each time he said it. And she looked at him with her steady dark eyes full of something warm and real, and said quietly that she supposed she was fairly happy herself. The spring of 1879 came in wet, which was welcome after the previous dry summer, and the Sweetwater Flats were extraordinary in the way of grassland after good rain, alive and thick, and the color of new money. Liberty, who was now a year old and the most opinionated horse on the property, had made her opinion of the new water system entirely clear by taking every opportunity to drink from the new troughs in preference to the creek, which Effie said was pure orneriness, and Alfred said was sophisticated preference, and Tommy said was just horse behavior, and they were both probably right. The consortium's infrastructure work had also benefited two of the neighboring operations significantly, and the coalition that Silas Drucker had built through the previous year's crisis had transformed into a genuine cooperative arrangement among the Sweetwater Flats ranchers, shared resources, coordinated cattle drives, mutual support during difficult seasons. Effie was one of its most active members, bringing the same clear-eyed practicality to the cooperative's decisions that she brought to her own operation. Bernard Collier visited in June and spent 3 days at the ranch reviewing some documentation, and also, it became apparent, simply enjoying the company. He had become genuinely fond of both Alfred and Effie, and he sat on their porch in the evenings with a look of a man who spent too much time in Denver offices appreciating the reminder that other kinds of life were possible. "You're going to need to think about expanding the operation," he said to Effie one evening. "The improved water access means you can carry more cattle through summer. Your grazing capacity has increased by at least 30% with the new system." "I know," Effie said. "I've been working through the figures. I could look at securing additional land on the north side, adjacent to what you already hold," Alfred said. "There's a parcel that's been unregistered for 2 years since the previous homesteader abandoned the claim. It would need to be properly filed." "You two think about the same things at the same time rather a lot," Collier observed. "We live on the same ranch," Effie said mildly. Their son was born in August of 1879, on a hot, still morning when the air smelled like dry grass and the creek was low but running. They had decided on James for a first name, after Effie's first husband, which Alfred had proposed himself, because he had understood that James Townsend was part of what this land was and always would be, and that honoring him was not a complication but a rightness. The middle name was Alfred's father's name, which was Henry. James Henry Watkins arrived in the world with the emphatic opinion that he had things to say about it, which Effie said was inherited from his father's tendency toward thorough communication, and Alfred said was clearly from her. And they were both laughing when they said it. And Tommy Briggs, who was hovering outside the door and came in when called, stood over the baby with the particular expression of a young man who has just understood that he is now part of a family in a way he hadn't quite anticipated. And he cleared his throat and said, "He's a good-looking baby," which was not something Tommy would normally have said in 1,000 years, and Alfred clapped him on the shoulder and Effie said from the bed with a tired and radiant face, "Yes, he is." The fall of 1879 was the fullest and most complete fall Alfred had ever experienced. He had filed the papers on the adjacent north parcel, which Effie had agreed to register in both their names, making it the first piece of land that was truly jointly theirs from the beginning. The expanded grazing capacity was already visible in the health of the herd, which had grown by 20 head over the summer. Tommy had taken on the full management of the south fence line, and the cattle rotation schedule with a competence that prompted Effie to increase his wages substantially, which he accepted with the nod of someone who had known his value all along and was pleased to have it recognized. The legal resolution of the consortium challenge was formalized in October, when the Territory Land Court issued a ruling confirming the invalidity of the conflicted valuations and ordering the bank to regularize all affected notes at fair terms. The Ranchers' Coalition received a modest financial settlement that was distributed among the affected operations based on their acreage. Effie's share of the settlement was enough to clear the last of what she owed Alfred on the original loan, and the day she handed him the final bank draft she did it with a directness that was entirely characteristic, handed it across the table with both hands, looked him in the eye and said, "Debt settled." He looked at the draft. "Effie," he said, "you didn't have to, the terms were the terms," she said firmly. "I don't want to owe you money, I want to owe you other things." He looked at her. "What other things?" he said. She looked at him with an expression that was a combination of things she rarely allowed to show all at once warmth and mischief, and something entirely unguarded. 20 years of fence work, she said. At minimum. He laughed and she laughed, and the baby, who was 2 months old and sleeping in the cradle near the stove, made a small sound as if registering his opinion, and the dogs on the porch shifted and settled. And outside, the Colorado evening was coming down in long red and gold waves over the Sweetwater Flats, coloring everything the warm, impossible color of things that last. He reached across the table and she met him halfway, the same as the first time, and he held her hands and said, 20 years of fence work seems like a reasonable arrangement." "It does," she agreed. "And after 20 years," he said. She thought about it with characteristic seriousness. "We renegotiate," she said. "Fair enough," he said. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was gentler than the previous one, which the ranchers took as a welcome adjustment after 2 hard years. The Townsend Ranch, which was still called the Townsend Ranch, because that was its name and its history, and neither Alfred nor Effie had seen any reason to change it, settled into the full rhythm of a well-run operation in good order. Alfred's work with Collier on the Territory land cases continued through the winter months, mostly through correspondence, and it paid enough to contribute meaningfully to the ranch's finances, without demanding the long absences that full-circuit writing would have required. He made 2 trips to Denver through the winter, both planned, both short, and both entirely unpleasant in the way that being away from somewhere you genuinely want to be is always unpleasant. On his second return from Denver in March of 1880, riding up the road in the early evening with the last of the winter snow still in the shadowed hollows but the first grass showing green in the sunny places, he saw the lamp in the kitchen window from a quarter-mile out, and he could see Effie moving inside, and there was smoke from the chimney, and the dogs had heard his horse and were at the gate, and it occurred to him, not for the first time, that this was the thing he had been riding toward his whole adult life, without knowing what it was he was looking for. She came to the door when he rode in, with James on her hip. James, who was 7 months old now, and had developed a definite and charming personality that included a strong preference for being carried rather than put down, which his parents were entirely unable to resist. And she looked at Alfred across the yard in the early spring evening and said, "You're late." "Stage was delayed at the Grazing crossing," he said, dismounting. "I kept supper warm," she said. "I know you did," he said. He kissed her at the door, and the baby grabbed his ear with the focused interest of someone exploring new territory. And he laughed and she laughed, and he took the baby and she took his coat, and they went inside and the door closed behind them. And the lamp made its warm circle in the kitchen window, and outside the Colorado night came down soft and full of stars over the Sweetwater Flats. Tommy Briggs that same spring turned 19, and around the time Alfred returned from Denver there was a girl in the picture, a daughter of the Hoffman family who farmed 8 miles to the east, a steady, cheerful young woman named Rose who had apparently appeared at a community supper in February, and whose general presence in Tommy's vicinity had produced a number of interesting changes in the young man's previously very consistent behavior, including a new attentiveness to his appearance and an increased frequency of rides toward the eastern side of the territory. Effie observed all of this with the expression of a woman who was privately delighted and publicly neutral on the subject, and she said to Alfred one evening that Tommy was going to need to make some decisions about his future if things went the direction they seemed to be going, because Rose Hoffman was a young woman who would need a man with a proper standing and a defined situation. You could offer him a partnership arrangement in the North Parcel, Alfred said. She had clearly already thought of this. I was considering it, she said. He's earned it when he and Rose, Alfred said, because it was fairly obvious. When, she agreed. He'll need somewhere of his own. The bunkhouse is fine for a single man, but it's not a home for two people. The North Parcel has a decent building site, Alfred said, on the rise above the East Creek Bend. Good soil, good drainage, good view. She looked at him with the assessing look. You've already been to look at it. I went for a ride, he said mildly. She shook her head in the way she did when she was not fooled by him but was somewhat charmed by the attempt. The following month, she offered Tommy Briggs a formal partnership arrangement on the North Parcel, with the understanding that he would be building his own operation there over time, while continuing to contribute to the Townsend operation in a defined capacity. Tommy received this with a stillness that meant he was feeling something very large, and then he said, very quietly, that he was grateful, and Effie said there was nothing to be grateful for. He had earned it, and Alfred watched the two of them and thought about the particular way that a good person creates something good around them simply by being who they are. Tommy Briggs proposed to Rose Hoffman in May of 1880 at a community dance in Morrow Creek, which Effie and Alfred attended with James in tow, wrapped in a blanket and thoroughly asleep through the music, which they considered a personal achievement. The community of Morrow Creek had largely continued to follow the Townsend Watkins situation with the fond interest of people who had watched the whole story unfold, and there was genuine warmth in the way people interacted with them at the dance. The way Clara Drucker came and sat with Effie and talked about the cooperative's upcoming summer plans, the way Grover from the saloon clapped Alfred on the shoulder and said things had worked out rather well, the way the minister who had married them said approvingly that they looked settled and healthy. Alfred, watching Effie from across the room while she was talking with Clara and laughing at something, laughing with her full self, the way she did when she was entirely at ease, thought about the morning he had ridden up to her ranch with his satchel of legal papers and his careful business approach, and he thought about how thoroughly and completely everything had gone differently from what he had planned, and he thought that it was the finest surprise of his life. She found him looking and looked back across the room at him, and she raised her eyebrows slightly, asking a question without words, and he shook his head slightly, meaning nothing, everything's fine, I'm just looking at you. And she tilted her head slightly in the way that meant she understood and was somewhat embarrassed by it but not actually displeased. And then she turned back to Clara, and he turned back to the conversation he had been having with Silas Drucker about the spring cattle count. And the dance went on around them. The summer of 1880 was the best summer the Sweetwater Flats had seen in years, good rain in May and June, followed by long, warm, dry months that cured the grass without burning it, and the cattle that grazed it came off the flats in the fall in the best condition Alfred had seen since arriving in the territory. The Townsend operation ran 48 head that summer, up from 31 the previous year, and the autumn sale at the Morrow Creek cattle market was the best financial outcome Effie had produced since before James Townsend's death. She sat with the account books the evening after the sale and worked through the numbers with Alfred at the kitchen table, with their son asleep in his crib and the lamp burning low and the comfortable sound of the ranch settling into night around them. And when she reached the final figure, she set down her pen and looked at it for a long moment. "We're clear," she said quietly. "Everything clear. No outstanding debt. operating capital for 2 full years of normal expenses, and the North Parcel's building fund fully set aside for Tommy and Rose. "That's a very good result," Alfred said. She looked at him across the table, and her expression was something he had learned to read over the course of nearly 2 years. It was the expression she had when something had genuinely moved her, and she was deciding whether to say so. "When you rode up that morning," she said, "with your papers and your consortium money and your very good suit." "My suit was not that good," he said. "It was a better suit than anyone around here was wearing," she said. "When you rode up, I thought," she stopped. "I thought, this is the thing that ends it. This is the thing that finally beats me. Because I knew the consortium could eventually push me out if they decided to apply enough pressure, and I knew the bank was a vulnerability, and I was tired. I'd been tired for 3 years, and I'd been pretending I wasn't." She looked at her hands on the table. "And then this man in a suit sat at my table and ate my food and told me the bank was going to call my loan and then said, 'I'm going to fix this,' like it was the obvious next thing to say." "It was the obvious next thing," he said. "Not to anyone I'd met before," she said. She looked up at him. "You gave me more than you came here to buy, Alfred. You know that." He thought about what she had said, the exact words of it. He had come to buy her grazing rights and had left having given her more than she started with. The loan paid off, the legal challenge won, the consortium's power in the flats broken, the cooperative built, the North Parcel added, the ranch grown and stronger than it had been when James Townsend was alive. And the other things, the things that didn't go in account books, the partnership that respected her authority over her own life, the honesty that went both directions, the particular happiness of 2 people who had found each other on the far side of enough difficulty to know the value of what they had. "You gave me more than I expected to," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. Then she closed the account book and reached across the table, and he took her hand. And it was the same gesture it had always been, halfway and halfway, meeting in the middle. And outside, the Colorado night was enormous and full of stars, and the creek ran steady over its stones, and the grass moved in the dark like something breathing. In the spring of 1881, Rose Briggs gave birth to Tommy Briggs's first child, a boy they named William, after Tommy's father, and there was a celebration at the Townsend Ranch that included half the Morrow Creek community, and lasted through an entire afternoon and into the evening, with food contributed by Clara Drucker and the Hoffman family and Mrs. Fitch from the boarding house, and Grover from the saloon, who arrived with 2 jugs of cider and his good humor, and Silas Drucker, who gave a toast that was direct and heartfelt, and made Tommy look at his boots and Rose look at the sky, and everyone else look at each other, with the warmth of people who have become a genuine community. Alfred held baby William for a portion of the afternoon and watched Tommy's face, while Rose held the baby and thought about everything that had started with a broken fence post, and a canteen passed back and forth between 2 people learning whether they could trust each other. James Henry Watkins, now nearly 2 years old and possessed of a personality that Alfred privately thought combined the best and most demanding aspects of both his parents, spent the afternoon pursuing the Drucker family's dogs with single-minded determination. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's broad shoulders in miniature, and a will that impressed everyone who encountered it. Effie, watching James from across the yard with the particular expression of a mother who is both exhausted and entirely in love with what is exhausting her, came and stood beside Alfred and said, "He is going to be a great deal of work." "He is already a great deal of work," Alfred said. "He is," she agreed. Then, after a pause, with the careful tone she used when she was saying something she had been thinking about for a while, she said, "I've been thinking about a second." Alfred looked at her. She was not looking at him but at James, who had just fallen down in the grass and gotten up with absolutely no concern for the event. "Have you?" he said. "I'm not saying immediately," she said. "I'm saying at some point, if the ranch can support it, which it can now, if you," she glanced at him, "if that's something you want." "Effie," he said, "everything I want is standing right here on this ranch." She looked at him, and the afternoon light was on her face, and she was 32 years old and more certain of herself than anyone he had ever known, and she said, "You are extremely sentimental for a businessman." "I'm not a businessman anymore," he said. "I'm a rancher." She looked at him with the measuring look that he had come to understand was the look she gave things she found genuinely sound. "Yes," she said, "you are." And she sounded, in saying it, like someone giving a verdict they were satisfied with. The second child was a daughter, born in the winter of 1882, when the snow was heavy on the flats and the cattle were in, and Tommy Briggs had to ride through a foot of snow to get Mrs. Barrow, the midwife, from Morrow Creek. Alfred spent those hours in the kitchen being useless in the way that men are useless in those moments, feeding the stove too much wood and making too much coffee, until Tommy came back with Mrs. Barrow, and Alfred was firmly relocated to the front porch, where he stood in the cold for 2 hours listening to the wind and not quite praying, because he was not a praying man but doing something very close to it. She was born just before midnight, small and loud and emphatically present, and Mrs. Barrow brought Alfred in, and Effie was tired and luminous and entirely herself, and she looked at him across the room and said, "Come see your daughter." He sat beside her on the bed and looked at this new small person with complete astonishment, as he had looked at James, because children are always astonishing regardless of how many you have had. The daughter had a faint reddish tinge to the hair she had arrived with, which was entirely unexpected, and which Alfred's mother, when informed by letter, attributed to a gray tan on the Ohio side of the family. They named her Clara Margaret Clara for Clara Drucker, who had been Effie's steadfast friend through the previous 4 years, and Margaret for Effie's mother, who had died in Virginia before Effie came west, and who Effie spoke of rarely but with a particular tenderness. Clara Drucker, upon being told that a baby had been named for her, sat down in her kitchen chair and cried for a full 5 minutes, which Silas Drucker witnessed and reported as the most remarkable thing he had seen in 20 years of marriage. In the summer of 1882, Alfred completed his last major case with Bernard Collier, a complicated boundary dispute between 3 territory ranchers that had been working through the land court for 18 months, and was finally resolved in a settlement that satisfied nobody entirely and everyone adequately, which Collier said was the definition of a successful legal outcome. Collier was talking about taking on a partner in his Denver practice, someone to manage the territory caseload while he focused on the more complex federal land questions, and he offered Alfred the position with considerable sincerity. Alfred said he would think about it, which he did, over 3 evenings on the porch with Effie and with Liberty, who was now 4 years old and had grown into an extraordinary horse, who still believed she owned the barn, standing in her paddock watching them with the equine certainty that whatever they were discussing was less interesting than her, but probably fine. It would mean time in Denver, Alfred said on the 3rd evening. How much time? Effie asked. Perhaps 30 days a year total, the rest manageable from here by correspondence. She was quiet, working through it the way she worked through everything. The ranch is stable, she said. Tommy handles the North Parcel operation independently now. We have 3 hands for the heavy seasons. 30 days is manageable. It would add to the income substantially, he said, which would allow the expansion on the east section we've been considering. I know, she said. I've done the figures. Of course she had done the figures. He smiled at the Colorado evening. What do you think? He asked. I think you should take it, she said. I think you're good at the law work and it matters. Those cases protect people like we were 3 years ago, people who don't know how the system works and need someone who does. She paused. I don't want to be the reason you stop doing something worth doing. You're not, he said. You're the reason I do everything I do. She gave him the look she gave that kind of statement, somewhere between moved and exasperated, which was a combination he found endlessly endearing. Alfred, she said. Effie, he said. She shook her head and looked at the sky, but she was smiling. Write to Collier, she said. Tell him yes. He wrote to Collier the following morning, and Collier wrote back by return stage to say he was delighted, and please come to Denver to sign the papers at his earliest convenience. And bring the family if you'd like. I have a large enough house, and I haven't seen young James since he was learning to walk." They went to Denver in September of 1882, the whole family, Alfred and Effie and James, who was nearly 3, and Clara, who was 9 months old, and Tommy Briggs, who came along, because someone needed to help manage 2 small children on a stage coach, and who spent most of the journey looking determinedly out the window, while James climbed on everyone within reach. Denver was larger than it had been when Alfred last lived there, growing fast with the railroad money and the mining money and all the commerce that followed both, and Effie looked at it with clear, interested eyes, absorbing it without being overwhelmed by it, which was entirely characteristic. Collier's house was as large as promised, and his housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Pace, took one look at the 2 small children and produced cookies, which Alfred considered an excellent indicator of character. Effie and Collier had a conversation at the dinner table about territorial land law that lasted 3 hours and impressed Collier visibly, which he expressed afterward to Alfred by saying, "Your wife understands the Homestead Act better than most of my associates. She understands most things better than most people," Alfred said. "Yes, I'm beginning to see that," Collier said. They returned to the Sweetwater Flats after 4 days in Denver with the signed partnership agreement in Alfred's bag, and a set of illustrated books for James that Effie had chosen at a Denver bookshop, with the specific intention of keeping him occupied through the stage ride home, which worked for approximately 40 minutes before he lost interest in books and returned to climbing on Tommy. The ranch met them on the return with everything in order, the fall cattle in the south pasture looking well, the house warm, the lamp in the kitchen window. Effie stood in the yard for a moment after they climbed down from the buckboard that had collected them from the Morrow Creek stage, and she looked at it all, the house and the barn and the paddock and the flats spreading out beyond in the late afternoon gold, and she breathed it in. And Alfred stood beside her with Clara on his arm and James already running toward the dogs, and she said, quietly and to no one in particular and to him specifically, "Home." "Yes," he said. The years that followed were full years, full of work and weather and children, and the ongoing story of the land. James grew into a boy who was curious about everything and opinionated about most of it, with his mother's directness and his father's inclination toward thinking before speaking, which was a useful combination. Clara grew into a girl of considerable independent spirit, who was already at age 3 negotiating with her brother for better terms on shared toys, which Effie observed with the expression of someone who recognized something very familiar. The Townsend ranch expanded as Effie had planned, the east section added in 1883 with proper title, the herd growing steadily, Tommy Briggs's operation on the north parcel, developing into its own solid entity with a proper house now, and young William Briggs toddling around the yard, and Rose Briggs working her kitchen garden with the same purposeful energy that Effie had always brought to hers. The Sweetwater Flats Cooperative that Silas Drucker had helped build became a formal organization in 1883, registered with the territory, with Effie Townsend Watkins as one of its founding officers. It managed the shared grazing coordination, the infrastructure maintenance agreement with the consortium, which had been substantially reduced in scale from their original ambitions, and now operated in the territory in a manner that the ranchers found, if not exactly welcome, at least manageable, and the mutual support functions that had organically developed among the member ranches. Alfred contributed to the cooperative through his land law work, advising on any new agreements that required legal review, which he did at a reduced rate that was his private contribution to the community his wife had helped build. Bernard Collier, visiting in the summer of 1884, sat on the Townsend porch in the evening and looked out at the flats and said to Alfred with the satisfied tone of a man taking stock, "You know, when you resigned from the consortium and wrote to me about this situation, I thought you'd lost your mind. I had, Alfred said. Fortunately, Collier smiled. You've done something here that most people don't manage, he said. Built something real. The legal work, the ranch, the community. It adds up to something. It does, Alfred said. Effie came out onto the porch with coffee and distributed cups with the efficient grace of someone who had done this 10,000 times. And she sat down in the chair beside Alfred's and pulled her shawl around her shoulders against the evening cool. And she looked out at the flats the way she always looked at them, as if they were something she had earned and intended to keep. She was 35 years old and the most capable person Alfred had ever known, and she was his wife. And she was going to keep this land for as long as she lived and pass it to her children and their children after. And it was going to be there in the Sweetwater Flats for as long as the creek ran, which was going to be a very long time. He reached over and she took his hand without looking, the way people touch each other when they no longer need to think about it, when it has become as natural as breathing, as necessary and as unremarked. Collier observed this and said nothing, which was the wisest thing he could have done. The evening came down over the flats in its Colorado way, vast and red and then purple and then full of stars beyond counting, the way it had come down on the first evening Alfred had sat on this porch, and on every evening since. The creek murmured over its stones. The cattle were settled. Liberty stood at the paddock rail in the last light, watching everything with her customary opinion of her own centrality to events. James called from inside, some small crisis of the child before bedtime variety, and Effie stood and went in, touching Alfred's shoulder as she passed, and he sat for a moment longer in the evening with Collier and the coffee and the wide, enormous sky. "Do you miss the work you used to do?" Collier asked, not unkindly. Alfred thought about it honestly. He thought about the leather satchel and the consortium papers and the careful speeches and the long road from Denver to property after property, acquisition after acquisition, each one a transaction and nothing more. He thought about the morning he had ridden up to a gate and seen a woman standing on a fence rail with her arms crossed and known, on some level that his careful brain had not yet caught up with, that this was different. "No," he said simply. And that was entirely true, and entirely enough. And the stars were coming up one by one over the Sweetwater Flats. And inside the house the lamp was burning in the kitchen window. And Effie Townsend Watkins was settling her children to bed in a house on land that was hers and always would be. And Alfred Watkins sat in the evening air of the Colorado Territory and felt the precise and uncomplicated satisfaction of a man who has found the thing that he was always meant to be doing, and is doing it, and knows it and is grateful for it every single day. He had come here to buy something. He had left having given more than he took, and received more than he could have imagined, and the account of it, unlike any account he had ever kept in his professional life, only grew richer with time. He finished his coffee and went inside, and the door closed behind him, and the lamp made its warm circle in the window, and the Sweetwater Flats lay quiet and vast and alive under the enormous Colorado night, holding all of it, the grass and the creek and the cattle and the graves and the history and the love, as it would go on holding all of it, through all the seasons still to come.